Story number 1. The Hills of Blackwater. The town of Blackwater sat nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by hills that reached toward the heavens like jagged, broken teeth. They were ancient, these hills, so old that no one truly remembered their first whisper in the wind. The townsfolk didn't speak much of them, but when they did, it was always in hushed tones, eyes flicking toward the towering ridges that seemed to pull the very light from the sky. Blackwater was a place of stillness. The streets were cobbled with time, and the buildings were as weathered as the people. But there was always something unsettling about the place, a heaviness that settled in the air, making the breath feel thicker, the shadows deeper, a sense that something was waiting, patient, just beyond the corner of your sight. The hills were the heart of this dark silence. Local legend had it that the hills weren't just hills. They were alive. Or rather, they were something inhabited. The old men spoke of how the hills, with their grotesque and haunting beauty, were filled with the bones of the unworthy. Those who wandered too far, who ventured into the twisted labyrinth of paths and rocks, were never seen again. Some said the hills were hungry. Some said they were cursed. But the truth, as always, was darker than the stories. A stranger came to Blackwater one cold autumn evening. His name was Arthur Holloway, a curious man with a restless spirit. He had no particular reason for coming to this desolate town, other than to escape a life that had begun to feel too small, too suffocating. He'd heard whispers in the bars, had seen the half-glances of fear in the eyes of the locals, and it all stirred something in him. A desire to know, to explore, to push past the things others feared. And so, it was the hills that beckoned him. He'd spent days walking around Blackwater, talking to the people, trying to piece together the stories. The old women spoke of the hills like they were sacred, warning him away with sharp eyes. The young men laughed nervously when he mentioned them, their discomfort clear. But it was the older man at the tavern who finally told him the truth, or something close to it. The hills, they're not what you think. They don't just hold secrets, they become them, the man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. People go up there looking for something, maybe a thrill, maybe answers to things that should stay buried. But the hills, they don't give answers, they take. Arthur didn't listen to the warning. He thought it was superstition, perhaps, or the overactive imagination of people who had lived in this lonely place too long. But that night, after the town had fallen silent, he slipped away and made his way up toward the hills. It was a moonless night, the sky thick with clouds. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it a strange, metallic scent. The deeper he walked into the hills, the more the world seemed to shrink around him. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like fingers. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though it were alive, watching him. As he moved further, a strange hum began to fill the air, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It grew louder with every step, vibrating through his bones, gnawing at his thoughts. And then he saw it. The entrance to the realm. It was a crack in the hillside, a dark wound in the earth that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. The moment Arthur stepped closer, he felt the air shift, cold, sharp, like a blade against his skin. His heart raced, his breath quickened, but something in him, the same thing that had brought him here, pushed him forward. He crawled through the crack, and the world on the other side was nothing like the one he knew. The air was thick with suffering, a tangible weight that clung to his skin. The sky above was a sickly green, the clouds swirling like smoke in the shape of tortured faces. And everywhere there was pain. In the ground, in the air, in the very stones. The hills weren't just alive, they were hungry. And it was then that Arthur understood. This place wasn't just a physical location. It was a realm, a place where suffering wasn't just endured, it was made, sculpted into something both beautiful and terrifying. The hills themselves fed on the agony of those who wandered too close, drawing out their pain, their terror, and weaving it into the very fabric of the land. The hills weren't cursed. They were creators, creating suffering, shaping it into something grotesque and powerful, feeding it back into the world. Arthur could hear the whispers now, voices carried on the wind. They were all around him, lost souls, their pain still echoing in the air, pleading for release. But it was too late for him. The hills had claimed him, and in this twisted realm, he was nothing but another offering, another piece of the nightmare that would never end. The hills of Blackwater were hungry, and now they had their newest feast. Story number 2. The Sacrifice of the Hills. The village of Ravenswood was small, barely a cluster of homes huddled together at the foot of the hills, where the land seemed to twist and writhe under the weight of something ancient. The hills were silent most of the time, but those who lived in the shadow of them knew the truth. The silence was nothing but a prelude. Every few years, a sacrifice had to be made to keep the horrors of the hills from swallowing the village whole. The people never spoke of it directly, but there were always whispers, the old, the young, the sick, all of them casting wary glances toward the hills. They knew the rituals. They knew the price. The hills, with their jagged peaks and endless forests, demanded blood. And that blood had to come from someone who belonged to the village, someone who had been marked from birth. As the time for the next sacrifice drew near, the villagers began to turn their eyes toward one woman, Adeline Harrow. She was different from the others, a young woman with pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that seemed too old for her years. Her heritage was one of mystery. The Harrow family had lived in Ravenswood for as long as anyone could remember, but there were no records of their origins. Some said they came from the hills themselves. Others whispered that they were descended from the first settlers who had made a pact with whatever dwelled beyond the hills, a pact that kept them safe, but at a terrible cost. Adeline had always known something was wrong. There was an unease that settled in her chest, a restless feeling that she couldn't shake. But when the elders came to her one evening, their faces grim and their eyes hollow with the weight of what they had to do, she knew that the time had come. "Adeline," they said, their voices strained, "the hills are calling again. It is your turn." Her heart froze in her chest as she heard the words, but something deeper inside her, something that pulsed in her blood, whispered a truth she had never dared acknowledge. The hills weren't just a place. They were something far worse. The ritual began the next evening. The villagers gathered in silence at the edge of the forest, their faces pale, their eyes cast downward, as they had done countless times before. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something darker, something more malevolent. Adeline stood before them, the weight of her fate heavy on her shoulders. The sky was overcast, the sun barely peeking through the clouds, as though even the heavens knew the gravity of what was about to happen. The elders chanted the ancient words, their voices rising in eerie harmony as the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Adeline could feel it, a shift in the air, a pull from deep within the earth, as if the very soil was hungry for what was to come. The hills loomed above them, their towering shadows stretching out like claws, waiting. And then, something changed. Adeline stepped forward, a strange force drawing her in, her feet moving of their own accord. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to run, but the pull was too strong. It was as though the hills themselves were calling her, speaking to her in a language older than time. The earth beneath her feet cracked open, and she fell to her knees, her body convulsing as her blood surged with a power she couldn't understand. In the depths of the fissure, something stirred. It wasn't a demon, as the villagers had always believed. No, what waited below the hills was far older, far darker. A race of creatures that had long ago abandoned the world of man. They were beings of shadow and bone, their forms twisted and contorted, their bodies composed of the very earth they had once lived beneath. They lived by devouring human souls, feeding on the essence of life itself. And they had been waiting for Adeline. Her bloodline, it seemed, was the key to their return. "You are the last," a voice whispered in her mind, cold and sharp as ice. "Your blood will open the gate. Your death will feed us." Adeline's body trembled with the weight of the revelation. The ritual, the sacrifice, it had all been a lie. The villagers weren't keeping the demons at bay. They were feeding the creatures below, sustaining them with each life offered to the hills. Her blood, her family's blood, had been the price for generations. But there was something else. A seed of rebellion, buried deep within her, began to stir. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her, the ones that no one else dared speak aloud. Her bloodline wasn't just cursed, it was chosen. The Harrows were not the descendants of the first settlers, nor were they servants of the creatures below. They were the wardens, the ones who had been tasked with keeping the hills sealed, keeping the creatures buried. And Adeline was the final key. If she died, the world would fall to the darkness. But if she lived, she could destroy them once and for all. Her decision was clear. She couldn't let the hills win. She couldn't let the cycle continue. With a final, desperate cry, Adeline thrust her hands into the crack in the earth, pushing against the force that sought to pull her in. Her blood boiled, her soul burning with the fire of her ancestors. The ground shook violently as the creatures below howled in fury, but she held firm. And then, with a deafening scream, the hills trembled and cracked open completely, spilling forth the ancient creatures into the world for the first time in centuries. But instead of feeding, they recoiled. The bloodline of the Harrows had broken their hold on the world, and the creatures, twisted, hollow, and hungry, were bound once more to the earth, imprisoned by the very force they had sought to escape. Adeline collapsed to the ground, her body spent, but her soul triumphant. The hills were silent once more. The sacrifice had been avoided, but at a terrible cost. The bloodline of the Harrows was no more. The hills, though silenced, would forever be haunted by the remnants of the creatures that had once ruled them. And the village of Ravenswood? It was free, at least for now. Story number 3. The Banishment. Jacob Granger had been running for years. Running from memories, from decisions he couldn't take back, from a past that seemed to claw at him from the shadows. He had always been quick to flee. Whenever things got too close, whenever the weight of his guilt became too much, he would pack his bags, change his name, and disappear into another town, another state, another life. But no matter how far he went, the past was never far behind. That evening, as he drove down an unfamiliar mountain road, he realized that this time he hadn't made the choice to run. The road had led him here. The mansion loomed ahead of him, an imposing structure perched on the edge of the hills, its silhouette dark against the twilight sky. It was secluded, isolated, far from any other sign of civilization. For a moment, Jacob considered driving past it, but something held him there. It wasn't just curiosity. The house seemed to call to him, an invisible pull that stirred something deep within him. He pulled up the gravel driveway, the car's tires crunching beneath him as if the earth itself was welcoming him. The mansion stood at the top of a hill, its windows dark and vacant. the stone walls weathered with time. It looked abandoned, but the longer Jacob stared, the more certain he became that this place was not as empty as it seemed. As he approached the door, a sudden gust of wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of voices. Murmurs, almost inaudible, but undeniably human. They seemed to beckon him forward. Hesitating for only a second, Jacob pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door itself gave way with ease. The inside of the mansion was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon streaming through the broken windows. Dust hung thick in the air, coating everything in a layer of decay. The walls were lined with ancient portraits, their eyes following Jacob as he stepped further into the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and as he ventured deeper into the house, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. He wandered through the labyrinth of hallways, each room seeming to stretch into another, each door opening into spaces that defied logic. Rooms appeared that shouldn't exist. Some were adorned with old furniture, others nothing but empty walls. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay, and the deeper Jacob moved into the mansion, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on him. It was then that he saw it, the first reflection. At the end of a long corridor, a large mirror hung on the wall. The glass was cracked in several places, but still, it shimmered in the faint moonlight. Jacob's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't just his face he saw. In the glass, he saw flashes of his past, scenes he had long since buried. His mother, lying on the floor, the blood staining her dress, the look of terror in her eyes. His father, screaming at him, the weight of his anger, the moment when the last of his family was lost to his violence. His best friend, lying in a ditch, his life slipping away because of one wrong decision. And himself, standing in the middle of it all, a spectator to his own destruction. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the reflections shifted. He reached out to touch the mirror, but his hand stopped short, as if an invisible force was keeping him at bay. The reflection of himself in the glass grinned back at him, a cruel, mocking smile that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. The mansion was not abandoned, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was a prison, a physical manifestation of the horrors Jacob had tried to outrun. Every corner, every room, held a piece of his past, a twisted echo of the sins he had committed. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as though the house itself was aware of his presence. Each step he took into its depths felt like a step deeper into his own hell. He tried to run, but the hallways twisted and turned in impossible ways, trapping him in a maze that didn't make sense. The mansion wanted him here. It had been waiting for him. As he stumbled through the rooms, desperate to escape, he realized that the mansion held more than just memories. It held the ghosts of his past, the people he had hurt, the lives he had ruined. The house had become a tomb for them, a place where their pain had festered and grown. They were trapped here, just as he was trapped in his own mind. Every hallway was a new chapter of his torment, every door a reminder of the suffering he had caused. Jacob's legs gave out beneath him, and he sank to his knees in one of the rooms. He was surrounded by the whispers now, the voices of the dead, the voices of the things he couldn't escape. The mansion, the hills, it was all a part of him, a reflection of his own guilt and shame. The door to the mansion slammed shut, locking him inside. The house was alive, breathing in time with him, and as he stood there, trembling, he realized that there would be no escape. Not now, not ever. The mansion wasn't just a prison for his past. It was a mirror, a twisted reflection of his soul, and he would remain here forever, lost in the labyrinth of his own darkness. And so, the mansion stood silent once again, a tomb for the man who had dared to run, but who had never truly escaped. Story number 4. The Hills That Listen. The hills had always been a place of mystery. Their jagged peaks rose from the earth like the bones of some forgotten creature, their ridges deep and silent, hiding secrets in their shadows. For years, they had stood untouched, their mysteries unspoken, their silence unbroken. But to a group of campers looking for adventure, that silence was the very thing that called them in. There were 5 of them: Adam, Sarah, Lucas, Emma, and Jack, young and eager to escape the chaos of everyday life. The hills were far away from the nearest town, nestled deep in a remote range that few people dared to visit. The forest surrounding the hills was thick, dense with trees that stretched high into the sky, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The perfect place to get away from it all. They arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as they set up their camp. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkening sky, and they sat in a circle, sharing stories and jokes as the world around them grew quieter. The hills loomed in the distance, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. As night fully settled in, a cold wind began to stir, rustling the leaves and sending shivers through the trees. At first, it was just the wind, they thought. But then, something strange began to happen. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze passing through the trees, but there was something unsettling about it. The sound seemed to come from the hills themselves, a soft, slithering murmur that echoed through the night air. Adam, who had been sitting closest to the fire, straightened up, glancing nervously toward the hills. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. The others fell silent, listening. The wind howled, but there was something else. A faint murmur, distant but clear, almost like a voice. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She shifted uncomfortably on the ground, hugging her jacket tighter around her. But the whispers didn't stop, they grew louder. They came from the hills, whispers that twisted in the air like the wind itself was speaking. Words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something ancient, something hungry in the sound, as if the land itself was breathing. As the night wore on, the whispers turned into something else. Distant cries. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Lucas, usually the skeptic, was the first to speak. "Okay, this isn't normal. We're too far out here for this to be just the wind. It's something else." Emma, whose face had gone pale, gripped her arms tightly. "Maybe we should pack up, head back to the car. This doesn't feel right." But before anyone could respond, a laugh echoed across the hills. A laugh. It wasn't just any laugh, it was hollow. A low, guttural sound that seemed to roll down from the hills themselves. It chilled their bones, a sound so unnatural that it made the fire flicker and sputter in the sudden cold breeze. The laugh wasn't human. It was wrong. Jack, who had been the first to suggest the trip, now stood up abruptly. His eyes were wide with fear, his voice hoarse. This is something else. We need to leave, now." But as they scrambled to gather their things, the sounds became worse. The whispers, the cries, and the laughter began to merge, growing louder and more frantic, as if the hills themselves were closing in on them. It felt as though the very earth beneath their feet was alive, listening, waiting. The night seemed endless. The shadows of the hills stretched across the ground, their outlines shifting, twisting. The wind had stopped, but the sounds continued, reverberating from every direction. There was no escape from the noise, no place to hide from the whispers that clawed at their minds. And then they heard it. The thrum. A deep, resonating pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself. It vibrated through their bones, through their hearts. It was as if the hills were listening, waiting for something that could awaken it. They froze, each of them frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests. The hills, they weren't just listening. They were listening for something specific. Something that, if heard, would wake an ancient terror long buried beneath the land. "Get out of here," Adam gasped, his voice shaking. "Whatever this is, it doesn't want us here. We've stirred it." But as they turned to leave, something stopped them, something deep in the hills, a sound so powerful it shook the ground beneath their feet. The whispering stopped. The laughter stopped. The crying stopped. Everything was still, silent. And then a roar, a deafening, bone-shaking roar that seemed to come from the very hills themselves, as though the earth was tearing apart. The sound was so deep, so raw, it rattled their minds, the force of it pushing them back, knocking them to the ground. The hills were waking up. They didn't wait to find out what would happen next. They ran, stumbling in the dark, their only goal to escape. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and twist, as if the very hills were moving, reshaping themselves, guiding them toward something. The roar continued, growing louder with every step they took. By the time they reached the road, breathless and terrified, they didn't look back. They didn't need to. They knew the hills were still listening, and what they had awakened would not forget their trespass. Story number 5. The Eyes in the Hills. Alex Hawthorne had made a name for himself as a photographer, capturing the haunting beauty of forgotten places. Abandoned houses, decaying factories, desolate beaches. He sought out locations that others would deem too eerie, too strange, or simply too dangerous. To Alex, they were opportunities to expose the dark soul of the world, a world most people were too afraid to see. But there was one place that had been calling to him for years: the hills. The range was located far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but wild terrain and thick forests. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, saying the place was cursed, haunted by something older than time itself. But Alex wasn't one to heed superstition. He saw the rumors as just that, rumors. He'd faced more than his share of strange places, and this would be no different. So, when he received a tip about the hills, he packed his gear, rented a jeep, and set off into the wilderness. The journey was longer than he had anticipated, and the road to the hills was rough. As he drove deeper into the mountains, the trees grew denser, the air colder. The farther he went, the less human presence he felt. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Finally, after hours of driving, he reached a clearing at the base of the hills. The place was silent, unnervingly silent, save for the distant rustle of wind in the trees. Alex set up his camp, eager to explore and capture the landscape with his camera. The air was thick with fog, the light dim and soft as the sun struggled to break through the clouds. He wandered into the hills, his boots crunching against the dry leaves and dirt, the camera hanging from his neck, ready to snap a shot of whatever strange beauty he might find. It wasn't long before he began to notice something odd: eyes. At first, they were just a flicker in his peripheral vision, the glint of something watching him from the crevices in the rocks, from the thick branches of trees. He brushed it off as his imagination, but then it happened again. Clearer this time. He turned his head to see, but when he looked, there was nothing there. He shook it off, focusing his lens on the landscape. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The deeper he went, the more unsettling it became. The eyes were everywhere, hundreds of them, peering out from cracks in the rocks, from the bark of twisted trees, from the shadows of the forest. Some were wide, some narrow, some unblinking, others blinking slowly, as if they were observing his every move. Their pupils were black, unyielding voids, and they seemed to follow him wherever he went. Alex's heart began to race. He snapped a photo, then another and another. Each time the flash illuminated the dark spaces, the eyes would vanish, only to reappear in a new place when he looked away. They were always there, watching him, waiting for something. He could feel it now, a creeping sense of dread seeping into his bones, but his curiosity kept him going. As the day wore on, Alex felt an overwhelming urge to delve deeper into the hills, to discover the truth behind the eyes that watched him. He couldn't stop himself. It was as though the land itself was calling to him, urging him to uncover its secrets. The deeper he ventured, the more the eyes seemed to multiply, the more intense their gaze became. They were no longer just watching. They were waiting for him. He paused at the edge of a steep rock formation, where the eyes were the most concentrated. He raised his camera, aiming it at a particularly large set of eyes that stared at him from a crack in the stone. As the flash went off, a strange, sharp pain shot through his chest, and he staggered back, nearly dropping his camera. He didn't understand what was happening. His mind was clouded, and something dark began to cloud his vision. He stumbled forward, his breath ragged, feeling as if he was being drawn into the very rocks themselves. Then, in a moment of clarity, he realized the truth. The eyes weren't just watching him, they were feeding on him, binding him to the land with every photo he took. The creatures, beings, that lived in the hills weren't just spirits or ghosts. They were something ancient, something far worse. They were trapped here, imprisoned in the hills for centuries, their souls bound to the earth. But now, they had found a way to break free. Through his photos, through his curiosity, they had found their key. With every click of the camera, Alex was tying himself to them, pulling himself deeper into their world. The more photos he took, the more he became part of the hills, part of the darkness that dwelled there. In a panic, Alex tried to leave, but the land wouldn't let him. The trees twisted around him, the rocks seemed to shift, blocking his path. The eyes were everywhere now, closing in on him, the creatures reaching out with invisible fingers. He could hear whispers in the air, the voices of the beings, their ancient language swirling around him, growing louder. He turned and ran, but no matter which direction he took, he couldn't escape. The hills had claimed him. His camera, still clutched tightly in his hand, was now his prison. The eyes followed him, closer and closer, each one an anchor that bound his soul to their ancient, twisted world. And as the darkness of the hills swallowed him whole, Alex Hawthorne's last photograph was taken. His own face, twisted in horror, caught forever in the lens, his soul forever trapped in the hills, with the eyes that watched and waited for the next to come. Story number 6. The Eternal Feast. The Waverly family had lived in their mansion for as long as anyone could remember. Perched atop a hill, their home overlooked a vast, sprawling forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. The mansion itself was a sight to behold, grand and opulent, its stone walls dark with age, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at the world below. It was a place of mystery, of whispers, and of secrets no one dared to uncover. The family's reputation was well known throughout the surrounding villages. They were aristocrats, wealthy beyond measure, and their name was spoken in hushed tones. The rumors were always the same, that the Waverleys practiced ancient forbidden rituals, that they drew power from the earth beneath their feet, and that there was something unnatural about their dealings. The townspeople spoke of strange lights seen in the windows at night, of strange sounds that echoed from the mansion at odd hours, and of guests who came but never left. No one ever spoke to the Waverleys unless it was necessary, and those who did often came away with an unsettling look in their eyes. But the truth, as always, was far darker than anyone knew. One evening, a traveler named Thomas Rayburn arrived in the village at the foot of the hill. He had been wandering for days, lost in thought and weary from his journey. He was an outsider, a man with no connections to the town or its people, a man who had no knowledge of the Waverley family or the mansion that loomed over the village. He was simply passing through, looking for a place to rest for the night. And so, when he saw the mansion, its grand silhouette rising against the setting sun, he made his way up the hill. As he approached the towering gates, a figure appeared from the shadows. A tall, elegant man dressed in black, with a sharp, regal air about him. His eyes were piercing, his features impossibly handsome, and his smile was both warm and unsettling. "Good evening, sir," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I see you've found our humble home. Please, allow me to offer you hospitality. We would be honored to have you join us for supper." Thomas hesitated, but the man's charm was undeniable. The invitation was too tempting to resist. After all, it had been days since he'd had a proper meal, and the warmth of the mansion seemed to call to him. So, with a polite nod, he accepted. Inside, the mansion was even grander than he had imagined. The air was thick with the scent of rich food, and the walls were adorned with dark tapestries and portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. The chandelier overhead gleamed with 1,000 candles, casting a flickering golden light across the room. The Waverley family greeted him like an old friend, their smiles genuine but their eyes sharp, watching him closely. There was a woman, Evelyn Waverley, who seemed to take a particular interest in him. Her beauty was ethereal, her skin pale as marble, and her eyes seemed to hold centuries of secrets. "Welcome, Mr. Rayburn," she said, her voice soft and hypnotic. "We are pleased to have you. Please join us for our feast." The dining room was immense, the table stretching across the length of the room, covered with silver platters piled high with food. Roast meats, fruits, and sweet pastries filled the table, and the air was thick with the rich aroma of spices and herbs. The Waverleys sat at the head of the table, their faces serene, their eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling hunger. As the meal progressed, Thomas couldn't help but notice something odd. The Waverleys didn't eat. They merely sipped from their goblets and smiled at him, as though waiting for something. He felt the tension growing in the room, an undercurrent of something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. The food on his plate was rich and flavorful, but it tasted wrong, like something he couldn't quite place. The more he ate, the more his stomach twisted, and the more the walls of the mansion seemed to close in on him. It was then that he realized. The Waverleys were not just watching him, they were waiting for him. The truth came to him in a sudden, sickening revelation. The Waverleys had made a pact, a dark, ancient pact with a god that resided deep within the heart of the hills, a god that fed on the souls of the innocent. And their feasts, these grand dinners with their carefully chosen guests, were not simply about indulgence, they were offerings. The guests, once they had been fed, were the offerings, their flesh and souls given to the god in exchange for power, immortality, and favor. The Waverleys had never been ordinary aristocrats. They were the servants of something much older, much darker. And Thomas, like all the others before him, had been chosen. As the realization sank in, he felt the floor beneath him begin to shift. The mansion seemed to warp, the walls twisting and turning, as if the very building itself was alive. The food on his plate writhed, transforming into something grotesque, something foul. The Waverleys were no longer smiling. Their faces were twisted, their eyes black as the void. And in the distance, deep within the mansion, he could hear it. A low, rumbling growl, the voice of the god, waiting, hungry. He tried to move, to flee, but his limbs wouldn't respond. The air was thick with an invisible force that held him in place. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was Evelyn's smile. No longer kind, but twisted with a dark, terrible glee. "You are our guest, Mr. Rayburn," she said, her voice now a cold, mocking whisper. "And you are also our offering." The Waverleys rose, their forms shifting and merging into something more monstrous than human. And as Thomas's soul was torn from his body, the mansion itself seemed to consume him, the hills below echoing with the eternal, hollow laughter of the dark god that waited at the heart of it all. The eternal feast had begun. Story number 7. The Children of the Hills. The village of Dry Hollow sat on the edge of the hills, a place few outsiders ever dared to venture. The villagers were a quiet, insular group, their lives hidden behind the thick mist that rolled down from the hills every morning and evening. They were suspicious of strangers, wary of anyone who came too close to the borders of their land. They kept their distance from the rest of the world, content to live in isolation, bound to the land that had shaped them. There was one rule that the villagers would never break: never, ever venture into the hills. No matter the reason, no matter the season, the hills were off limits. But for years, no one had questioned why. It was just understood. The children were told stories, but the stories were vague, incomplete, whispered with fear rather than clarity. But then, one summer, a group of strangers came to Dry Hollow. They were curious, intrigued by the rumors that circled the village. The odd customs, the strange looks, the way the villagers seemed to avoid any conversation about the hills. They knew there was something there, something that made the village different from any other they had visited. The strangers were a mix of journalists, explorers, and academics, each looking for their own answers. They arrived one hot afternoon, and the villagers eyed them with suspicion but said nothing. The village elder, an old woman named Eleanor, was the only one who dared speak with them. Her skin was pale, her hair thin and white, and her voice cracked like dry leaves when she warned them. "Stay away from the hills," she said, her eyes wide with some unspoken fear. "The hills do not want you here. They never have. Leave before it's too late." But the strangers were not so easily dissuaded. They pressed on, determined to find the truth about Dry Hollow. Their questions came one after another, each more insistent than the last. Eleanor's warnings grew more desperate, but the group was undeterred. After all, they had traveled so far, and the mystery of the hills was too tempting to resist. And so, one evening, under the guise of darkness, they made their way up the winding path that led into the hills. The village, nestled at the base of the range, seemed to fall away behind them as they climbed higher. The air grew colder, the trees thicker, and the sounds of the village faded until there was nothing but the soft rustle of the wind and the echo of their footsteps. The deeper they went, the stranger the land became. The hills were alive in a way they couldn't explain. There was a pulse in the earth, a beat that seemed to come from the very heart of the hills themselves. The trees were twisted and knotted, the ground soft and uneven beneath their feet. It felt wrong, as though the land itself was watching them. After hours of walking, they found what they had been looking for: a clearing in the woods with an old stone building in the center. It was ancient, covered in vines, but it looked like it had once been a church or a temple. The air in the clearing felt heavy, thick with some unseen presence, and the group hesitated. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath their feet, and the sky above seemed to darken, From the shadows, figures emerged, children, no older than 10 or 12, their faces pale, their eyes dark and unblinking. They came from every direction, moving with unnatural speed, their bodies twisted and malformed in ways that were impossible to describe. They looked human, but their features were wrong. Too sharp, too alien, as if they didn't belong. The strangers froze, their breaths shallow, their minds racing. These children were like nothing they had ever seen before, and they could see the same confusion mirrored in the eyes of the children. There was something wrong with them, something hidden beneath the surface. The children didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were the guardians of the hills, the protectors of something darker than the world could understand. Eleanor's voice echoed in the air, her words spoken from behind them, from the edge of the clearing. "They are not just children," she said, her voice trembling with a deep, ancient terror. "They are the children of the hills, born of the earth itself. They are the offspring of the creatures that dwell beneath us. The hills gave them life. They are the keepers. They are the guardians." The strangers turned to face her, but the fear had already taken root in their hearts. They understood now, too late. These children, these twisted beings, were no mere product of nature. They were bred, created through the union of human women and the creatures that lived beneath the hills. Creatures that fed on the very essence of life, that thrived in the darkness below. The children stepped forward, their eyes glistening with an unnatural light. They were bound to the hills, tied to the land, and they would protect it at all costs. The strangers in their foolishness had come too close to the truth. They had disturbed something that was never meant to be found. The children raised their arms, and the ground beneath the strangers' feet began to tremble. From the earth, hands emerged, long, clawed fingers that reached up from the soil, pulling the strangers into the depths. The children watched silently, their faces cold and expressionless. This was the price of curiosity. This was the price of trespassing. The last thing the strangers heard before they were swallowed by the earth was the sound of a single, chilling laugh. A laugh that came not from the children, but from deep beneath the hills, from the creatures that had made the pact so many years ago. The children would guard the hills forever, and those who ventured too close would never be seen again. The village, as always, remained quiet, and the hills stood watch over everything, listening, waiting. The children were their eyes, and their hunger was endless. Story number 8. The Hill of Lost Souls. Nathaniel Walker had spent most of his life running. Running from mistakes, running from guilt, running from a past that wouldn't let him go. The sins he had committed, the people he had hurt. He could feel their weight on his chest every single day, and it was becoming unbearable. He had heard the stories about the Hill of Lost Souls, a place said to be sacred, ancient, where the souls of the damned were bound for eternity. Some said the hill could offer redemption to those brave enough to seek it, while others claimed it was a place of torment, where the lost souls were kept for their sins, endlessly punished by the very land itself. Nathaniel, desperate for peace, hoped the former was true. He arrived at the base of the hill just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The hill loomed before him, rising high into the sky, its peak shrouded in mist. The trees that lined the base were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching out like clawed hands, reaching for something, perhaps for him. But Nathaniel was undeterred. This journey was his last chance, the final attempt to find peace in a world that had long since abandoned him. The path up the hill was narrow, winding and treacherous, but he pressed on, his boots crunching against the dry earth with every step. The air felt thick, as though the hill itself was breathing, exhaling something ancient, something heavy. He couldn't explain it, but something about the land felt wrong, as if it were watching him, waiting. As Nathaniel climbed higher, the silence grew more oppressive. There were no birds, no animals, just the sound of his own breathing and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. But then, he heard something else. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. He stopped, straining to listen. "Help me, please." The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably human. Nathaniel's heart raced, and he stepped off the path, searching for the source of the voice. That's when he saw her, standing among the trees, a woman with hollow eyes and a face twisted in pain. Who are you?" Nathaniel asked, his voice shaking. The woman's lips curled into a grimace, her body jerking unnaturally. "I am what you will become." Suddenly, she lunged at him, her hands grasping for his throat, but she vanished before he could react, dissolving into the air like mist. Nathaniel staggered backward, his pulse pounding in his ears. His breath came in short gasps. He knew he shouldn't have been startled. He had heard the stories. The souls of the damned were said to haunt the hill, each one trapped by their own sins, twisted and deformed by their desires. But he had hoped, foolishly, that it was all just superstition. He continued up the hill, his legs growing heavy with each step, as though the very earth beneath him was fighting his ascent. The whispers began to grow louder, a cacophony of voices, each one crying out in agony, each one pleading for release. He tried to ignore them, but the air grew thick with their presence, suffocating him. The hill was alive, that much was certain, and it was hungry. With every step he took, the voices grew closer, more distinct. He began to see the figures, ghostly shadows that emerged from the fog. Men and women, their bodies distorted by their sins, their faces contorted in torment. One figure, a man with bloodied hands and a hollow stare, reached out to him. "Please," the man whispered, "help me. I killed her. I killed my wife. I couldn't save her." Nathaniel recoiled, his heart aching with the weight of the man's words. But before he could speak, the man vanished into the fog. Another figure appeared, a woman, her face twisted with greed, her eyes wild. "I took everything from them," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "I took it all, and still, I wanted more. I needed more." Nathaniel stepped back, his mind reeling. Each figure, each soul, was a mirror of his own guilt. The hill was showing him the sins he had buried, the pain he had caused, the people he had hurt. He couldn't escape it. The hill wasn't just a place. It was a reflection of his soul. A place where the land itself fed on the sins of those who sought redemption. And it had been waiting for him. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and Nathaniel felt an overwhelming pull, as if the hill itself was trying to swallow him whole. The whispers became screams, and the figures lunged at him, their twisted forms reaching out with hands that clawed at his skin. The hill was feeding on him now, drawing him deeper into its depths. He tried to run, but the earth shifted beneath him, the soil giving way like quicksand, pulling him down. With each step, the hill's hunger grew stronger, its grip tightening around his body and soul. He could feel it, the insatiable need, the endless hunger of the land, dragging him down into the earth. In his final moments, Nathaniel realized the truth. The hill didn't offer redemption. It offered damnation. It was a place for those who sought to escape their sins, a place where the very earth itself feasted on their guilt. And now, Nathaniel would be another soul trapped in the hill's endless hunger. As the darkness closed in, Nathaniel felt his body being consumed, his soul devoured by the land he had tried to conquer. The hill of lost souls had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him, and it would claim many more in the years to come. Story number 9. The Plague of the Hills. The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in fear, and for good reason. Every decade, without fail, a deadly plague would descend upon the village, taking lives without mercy. The disease was always the same. People would fall ill with fever, their skin turning pale, their bodies wasting away until nothing was left but a hollow shell. The village had grown accustomed to it over the years. They knew it was coming, and when it did, the only thing they could do was wait. The plague originated from the hills, the towering, craggy mountains that surrounded Black Hollow. No one dared venture too close, for the hills were cursed, or so the villagers believed. There were stories, whispered in the darkest corners of the tavern, about the creature that dwelled deep within the hills, an ancient being that had made a pact with the land long ago. The plague was said to be its doing, a curse that demanded a sacrifice every 10 years. And so, every decade, the village suffered, the plague coming and going like a terrible cycle. This year, however, something was different. The plague had taken hold early, striking down a dozen people within days. The usual feverish illness had spread like wildfire, but something felt more sinister this time. The disease was spreading faster, and the bodies that fell were more grotesque, more twisted. People began to panic, whispers turning to shouts in the streets. Some of the elders spoke of a prophecy, an old legend passed down through generations, about a group of survivors who would one day rise up and stop the curse. But the people were skeptical. They had no real hope. Except for a small group of villagers who refused to let the plague take them without a fight. There was Isaac, a former soldier who had returned to Black Hollow after years of wandering. He was a man of few words, but when the plague began, he knew something had to be done. There was also Lena, a schoolteacher who had lost her young daughter to the plague a decade ago. She was tired of waiting, tired of burying the dead year after year. And then there was Thomas, the town's blacksmith, whose own wife had been taken by the disease only days before. Together, they decided to investigate the source of the plague. They knew the hills were the key, but what they didn't know was that the hills themselves were hungry. The group gathered at the edge of the town, standing at the foot of the dark, looming hills. The air was thick with fog, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like fingers. The hills felt alive, as though they were watching them, waiting for them to make the first move. Isaac, Lena, and Thomas exchanged glances before stepping forward, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. The journey would be treacherous, but they had no choice. They couldn't let the hills take any more of their people. As they ascended the hills, the air grew colder, the silence pressing in around them. Every step they took seemed to pull them deeper into the darkness, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. But they pressed on, determined to find the truth. Hours passed before they stumbled upon the entrance to an old cave hidden beneath a cluster of twisted roots. It was barely visible, but as they stepped closer, they felt a pulse, a vibration in the air. It was as if the land itself was alive, breathing beneath their feet. Without a word, they entered the cave. The darkness inside was suffocating, but they made their way deeper, their lantern flickering dimly in the cold air. The walls of the cave were rough, jagged, like the bones of some ancient beast. The further they went, the more they could feel the presence, an oppressive force pressing in on them. They reached a vast chamber, and in the center of the room was something that took their breath away. It was a creature, ancient, twisted, and enormous. Its body was like a mass of writhing shadows, its skin covered in scales that seemed to shimmer and shift in the dim light. It had no true shape, no solid form. It was a being of pure darkness, a manifestation of the land itself. Its eyes glowed with a deep, insatiable hunger, and it looked at them with a cruel, knowing gaze. "You've come," the creature's voice echoed, deep and resonant, vibrating the very walls. "I've waited for you." Isaac, Lena, and Thomas stood frozen in fear, unable to speak. The creature's voice was both terrifying and hypnotic, drawing them in. "The plague," the creature continued, "is not a disease, it is a sacrifice. For every decade, the land demands blood, the blood of your people. It is my offering, and in exchange, I allow your town to live." Lena gasped. You're the one behind the plague?" The creature's eyes gleamed, a cruel smile curling across its twisted form. "I am the hills. I am the earth beneath you. I am what keeps your town alive, and when you stop offering your people, when you stop honoring the pact, I will take everything." The realization hit them all at once. The plague wasn't a disease. It was a curse, an ancient pact made long ago between the creature and the people of Black Hollow. Every 10 years, the creature demanded a sacrifice. And this year, the town had grown too weak, too desperate to break the cycle. The hills had come to collect. The creature loomed closer, its dark form swelling, ready to consume them. But Isaac, driven by a need to protect his town, made a decision. "We won't be your sacrifices anymore," he shouted, drawing his knife and plunging it into the earth beneath him. The ground shook violently, and the creature's roar echoed through the cave. The earth trembled as if in pain, and for a moment the dark being hesitated, its form flickering like a fading shadow. Lena and Thomas joined in, each of them stabbing their weapons into the ground, channeling their collective will. The creature screamed in fury, but the ground beneath it began to crack and crumble. With a final, earth-shattering cry, the creature collapsed into the earth, its form dissolving into the darkness, leaving only silence behind. The trio stood together in the quiet, breathing heavily. They had broken the curse, but at what cost? The hills were silent now, no longer hungry. But as they looked back down at Black Hollow, they knew that the town could never return to the way it had been. The pact had been broken, and the land was free, but it was no longer theirs to claim. The plague was over. But the price for breaking the curse was a steep one, and the survivors were left to face the unknown, knowing that some things, some forces should never be awakened. Story number 10. The Hill's Wrath. A group of explorers, young and full of ambition, had heard the rumors. The hill range that no one had dared to chart. A place untouched by civilization. A place where the land still held secrets, where the air was thick with mystery. It was the perfect challenge for thrill-seekers like them. There was Jack, the leader, bold and confident, always the one to push the group further. Then there was Sarah, the quiet but sharp-eyed photographer who saw beauty in the most desolate of places. Ben was the tech guru, always with a gadget or two in hand, his mind more focused on data than the surrounding environment. And finally, Emma, who was curious but cautious, always second-guessing her decisions but trusting her instincts when it mattered most. They had traveled for days to find this uncharted range of hills. The landscape was barren, almost alien. The hills rose in jagged peaks, their surfaces dark and rocky, covered in dense vegetation that felt like it had been untouched by human hands for centuries. The air felt different here, heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The first day was uneventful, but the further they trekked into the hills, the more a strange unease began to settle over the group. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air that never quite seemed to dissipate, the way the trees seemed to sway even when there was no wind, and the odd feeling that they were being watched. Jack, ever the leader, brushed it off. It's just the isolation. We're not used to this kind of place." But as night fell and they set up camp, things began to change. Sarah, sitting alone by the campfire, glanced around and saw something moving in the shadows. She stood up quickly, heart pounding, but when she looked again, nothing was there. It was as if the land itself had shifted. By the second night, the unease had grown into something darker. Jack became irritable, snapping at the others for no reason. Ben started murmuring to himself, pacing back and forth, as if something was tugging at his mind. Emma couldn't sleep, the sensation of being watched so strong that she felt the very ground beneath her shifting. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong here." But Jack wouldn't hear it. "We're close to the summit. We've come this far. We're not turning back now." The third day was when it all began to unravel. They had reached the heart of the hills, a place where the ground was cracked and the air felt thick, as if the earth was alive beneath their feet. The trees twisted unnaturally, their limbs curling into grotesque shapes, and the very rocks seemed to pulse with a deep, slow rhythm, like a beating heart. That's when the hallucinations began. Jack was the first to fall. He started to see things, visions of people, faces twisted in agony, crawling toward him from the depths of the earth. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion, but then the faces began to speak to him, whispering terrible things. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, unable to escape the cacophony of voices that filled his mind. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, rushing to him. "Jack, what's happening to you?" But Jack didn't answer. He was lost in a nightmare of his own making. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face contorted in terror as the hallucinations twisted around him. Then, it was Sarah's turn. As she tried to pull Jack to his feet, the ground beneath her shifted, and the earth cracked open. The shadows grew, stretching out like claws, and a massive shape emerged from the depths of the soil, an ancient figure, its form like that of a man, but its limbs were twisted, its skin cracked and rotting. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and it smiled. A wide, cruel grin that stretched far too wide. The figure reached for Sarah, and in that moment she felt an overwhelming rage surge within her, a burning fury that wasn't her own. It filled her chest, clouding her thoughts, turning her into something monstrous. She screamed, but the scream was not her voice anymore. It was the voice of the land, of the hills themselves. Ben, too, had succumbed. He was muttering incoherently, his eyes wide and bloodshot, as he stumbled through the forest, tearing at his own skin with his bare hands. His body began to twist, his limbs elongating and twisting like the branches of the trees that surrounded them. His features blurred, morphing into something alien, his form stretching into an inhuman shape. His scream was a gurgled rasp as he collapsed into a pile of shifting flesh. Emma, her heart racing, felt the last of her will slip away. The land, the hills, were no longer just a place. They were alive, sentient, and they were hungry. The rage, the fear, the hunger, everything that had been suppressed within them was being drawn out by the hills, twisted into grotesque shapes by the land's insatiable thirst for suffering. The hills were punishing them for their trespass, for their intrusion into a world that had long since belonged to something darker. She tried to run, but the earth reached for her, the soil grabbing at her feet, pulling her deeper into the ground. The hills were alive, but not in the way she had imagined. They were not simply a place of nature. They were an ancient force, older than time itself, a living entity that craved the souls of those foolish enough to disturb its peace. And as Emma was pulled into the earth, her body contorted and twisted by the land's rage, she understood. The hills weren't just a backdrop to their journey. They were the enemy. And now, the hills had claimed them all, their bodies and minds consumed by the very rage they had unleashed. The hills had always been vengeful, and they would never forget.